a little beggar girl rescues a wheelchair-bound millionaire abandoned in the rain, unaware of who he really is. In the following days, she struggles to keep him alive, but very strange things start happening. When she discovers the truth about the man and what really happened to him, she is shocked. If this story interested you, subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like this video and tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll keep going. The relentless rain pounded against the cracked pavement, creating small rivers that flowed through the empty streets of Cedar Grove. Sarah huddled deeper under the market's awning, pulling her worn jacket tighter around her thin frame. At 10 years old, she had already mastered the art of finding shelter in the most unlikely places. The closed grocery store's entrance had become one of her favorite spots during storms like this one. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the deserted street for a brief moment. In that flash of brightness, Sarah caught sight of something unusual. A figure slumped over in what appeared to be a wheelchair, right in the middle of the road. Her heart skipped a beat as another flash revealed the figure hadn't moved. Sarah pressed herself harder against the wall, trying to convince herself it wasn't her problem. She had learned early on that survival meant minding her own business. The streets of this small town had taught her that lesson repeatedly over the years, yet something about the stillness of that figure tugged at her conscience. Thunder rolled overhead as she debated with herself. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and the temperature was dropping. Sarah knew all too well how dangerous nights like these could be. With a resigned sigh, she stepped out from under her shelter, the cold rain immediately soaking through her already damp clothes. As she approached the wheelchair, she could make out more details. The man sitting in it was wearing what must have been an expensive suit, now completely drenched. His head was tilted at an awkward angle, and his skin had an unhealthy pallor that made Sarah's stomach clench with worry. "Mister?" she called out softly, touching his shoulder. The man's eyes fluttered open, revealing unfocused brown irises. His lips moved, but the words were too quiet to hear over the storm. Sarah leaned closer, her ear near his mouth. "Help," he whispered, his voice barely audible. They're trying to..." His words trailed off as his head lolled to the side again. Looking around the empty street, Sarah realized she was on her own. The few businesses that lined this part of town were all closed for the night, their windows dark and uninviting. She knew from experience that knocking on random doors rarely led to anything good. People tended to be suspicious of street children, especially after dark. With strength born of desperation, Sarah positioned herself behind the wheelchair. "I'm going to help you," she said, more to reassure herself than the semi-conscious man. "There's a spot not far from here where we'll be dry at least." The wheels squeaked in protest as she began pushing, fighting against the uneven pavement and the small streams that had formed in the street. The man was heavier than she expected, and the wheelchair seemed to resist her every effort. But Sarah persisted. She had learned long ago that giving up wasn't an option. Down a narrow alley between two brick buildings, there was a recessed loading dock that Sarah sometimes used as a shelter. It wasn't much, but it was dry and hidden from the street. With the last of her strength, she maneuvered the wheelchair into the space. Under the weak light of a distant street lamp, Sarah could better see the man's condition. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and his skin felt clammy to the touch. What worried her most were his eyes. When they occasionally opened, they seemed unable to focus on anything. From her small backpack, Sarah pulled out a slightly squashed sandwich, her entire food supply for the next day, and a bottle of water she had filled at a park fountain. The man's hands trembled too much to hold anything, so she helped him take small sips of water. "What's your name?" she asked, trying to keep him conscious. His response was barely comprehensible. Thomas Blackwood." He grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "Have to warn, they're going to..." His words dissolved into unintelligible mumbling. Sarah sat back on her heels, studying the strange man she had just rescued. His clothes, though wet and muddy now, were clearly expensive. The wheelchair, despite its current sorry state, looked like it cost more than most people in town made in a month. Everything about him seemed out of place in this rundown part of the city. As the night wore on, Sarah noticed something else that made her increasingly uneasy. Instead of improving, with rest and water, Thomas seemed to be getting worse. His skin was taking on a greyish tinge, and occasionally his whole body would shake with violent tremors. "Big house on hill," he muttered between episodes of unconsciousness. "Papers in the study." "Behind the—" His voice faded again before he could finish. Sarah pulled her knees up to her chest, watching the rain continue to fall beyond their shelter. She had thought she was just helping someone in need, but now she felt caught up in something much bigger and potentially dangerous. Yet as she looked at Thomas's deteriorating condition, she knew she couldn't just walk away. In the distance, a clock tower struck midnight, its deep bells barely audible over the storm. Sarah settled in for a long night, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges. For now, all she could do was keep watch and hope that Thomas would make it through until morning. The next morning dawned grey and misty, the aftermath of the night's storm still hanging heavy in the air. Sarah had dozed off sometime before dawn, her small body curled up against the wall of the loading dock. She awoke with a start to find Thomas muttering in his sleep, his condition visibly worse than the night before. In the harsh morning light, Sarah could see strange purplish marks appearing on his neck and hands. His skin had taken on a waxy appearance, and his breathing had become even more labored. Something was very wrong. This wasn't just illness or exposure to the elements. "Thomas," she shook him gently. "Can you hear me? We need to get you some help." His eyes opened slightly, more alert than they had been the previous night. "No, hospitals," he gasped. "They'll find me there, not safe." His hand clutched at his chest as if in pain. Sarah bit her lip, considering her options. In her years on the streets, she had developed a small network of people who sometimes showed her kindness. A baker who would give her day-old bread, a librarian who let her read books without a card, and a few others. But this situation required more than just small acts of kindness. Then she remembered the elderly couple who lived 3 blocks away. Mr. and Mrs. Chen had once taken her in during a particularly cold winter night, feeding her hot soup and letting her sleep on their couch. They had even offered to help her find more permanent arrangements, though Sarah had been too scared to accept at the time. "I know somewhere we might be able to go," she told Thomas. "But it's a few blocks away. Can you hold on that long?" He nodded weakly, and Sarah began the difficult task of maneuvering the wheelchair out of their overnight shelter. The streets were still relatively empty, for which she was grateful. The few early morning workers they passed barely gave them a second glance, a common reaction to those who lived on the streets. As they made their way through the quiet neighborhoods, Sarah noticed something that made her pulse quicken. A black car with tinted windows was moving slowly along the cross street, the driver seemingly searching for something. When it turned in their direction, Sarah quickly pushed the wheelchair into a narrow space between 2 buildings, holding her breath until the vehicle passed. The Chens lived in a modest house with a small garden out front. Sarah's heart was pounding as she pushed the wheelchair up to their door and knocked. For a long moment, there was no response, and she feared they might not be home. Then the door creaked open, and Mrs. Chen's familiar face appeared. Her expression shifted from surprise to concern as she took in the scene before her. "Sarah, what's happened?" "Please." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "He needs help. I didn't know where else to go." Mrs. Chen exchanged a quick look with her husband, who had appeared behind her. Without hesitation, they helped Sarah bring the wheelchair inside, closing the door firmly behind them. As Mr. Chen helped settle Thomas on their couch, Mrs. Chen pulled Sarah aside. "Child, do you know who this man is?" Sarah shook her head. But before she could respond, Thomas spoke up from the couch, his voice stronger than it had been all morning. "My name is Thomas Blackwood," he said, causing Mrs. Chen's eyes to widen in recognition. "Blackwood? Of Blackwood Industries?" Mr. Chen asked, his expression grave. Thomas nodded weakly. "My brother. He's done something to me. Poison. In my medicine." His words were interrupted by a fit of coughing that left him gasping for air. Mrs. Chen sprang into action, heading for their kitchen. "I have some knowledge of traditional remedies," she said. They might help slow whatever is in your system. Sarah watched as the elderly couple worked together, brewing a strong-smelling tea and helping Thomas drink it. She had known they were kind, but seeing them take charge of the situation without question made her throat tight with emotion. As Mrs. Chen tended to Thomas, Mr. Chen drew Sarah aside. "There are rumors about the Blackwood family," he said in a low voice. "The younger brother, Richard, took control of the company 6 months ago. There were questions about how it happened, but nobody dared speak up." Sarah glanced at Thomas, remembering his desperate words about betrayal and danger. She was about to ask Mr. Chen more questions when something caught her eye through the window, the same black car from earlier, moving slowly down their street. "We need to close all the curtains," she said urgently. "Someone's looking for him." Mr. Chen moved quickly, drawing the curtains while his wife continued to care for Thomas. As the room darkened, Sarah could feel the tension rising. What had started as a simple act of kindness during a storm was becoming something far more dangerous, and she had a feeling things were about to get much worse. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the gaps in the Chen's curtains as Sarah helped Mrs. Chen change the compress on Thomas's forehead. His condition had stabilized somewhat thanks to Mrs. Chen's herbal remedies, but the mysterious purple marks on his skin continued to spread. In his more lucid moments, Thomas had been writing in a small notebook he kept hidden in the lining of his wheelchair. "Sarah," he called out weakly, gesturing for her to come closer. When she approached, he pressed the notebook into her hands. "Keep this safe. Everything is in here. The proof, the accounts, the names." His voice trailed off as another wave of pain racked his body. Sarah tucked the notebook into her jacket pocket, noticing how Mr. Chen stood vigilant by the window, periodically checking the street through a small gap in the curtains. The black car had passed by 3 more times, each circuit making everyone in the house more nervous. "Someone's coming up the walk," Mr. Chen suddenly whispered, his voice tense. 2 men in suits." Mrs. Chen quickly ushered Sarah and Thomas into the back bedroom. "Stay quiet," she instructed, closing the door softly behind them. Through the thin walls, Sarah could hear the sound of knocking, followed by voices. She pressed her ear against the door, straining to listen. "Good afternoon," a smooth, cultured voice said. "I apologize for the intrusion, but we're looking for my brother. He's very ill and wandered away from his care facility. We're quite worried about him." Sarah felt Thomas grip her arm tightly. His face had gone even paler and he was shaking his head frantically. "I'm sorry," she heard Mr. Chen reply. "We haven't seen anyone. We're retired, you see. Don't get many visitors. Mind if we take a look around? It's a matter of family concern." Sarah's heart began to race. She looked around the room desperately, her eyes landing on a small window that led to the back garden. It would be a tight squeeze, but maybe. The sound of footsteps in the hallway spurred her into action. With strength she didn't know she possessed, Sarah helped Thomas out of the wheelchair and toward the window. Her hands trembled as she worked to unlock it, acutely aware of the voices getting closer. Just as she managed to push the window open, the bedroom door handle began to turn. Mrs. Chen's voice rang out suddenly from the hallway, loud and distracting. "Oh my, I just remembered I left something on the stove." The momentary distraction was all they needed. Sarah helped Thomas through the window, trying to be as gentle as possible despite their desperate hurry. She followed quickly behind, pulling. The window almost closed behind her. They crouched beneath the window, hardly daring to breathe. Thomas was trembling with the effort of staying upright, and Sarah could feel his fever burning through his clothes where she supported him. Through the open window above them, they could hear the men moving around the room. "The wheelchair," one of them said. "It's still warm, they're close." "Search the grounds," the smooth voice commanded. They couldn't have gotten far. Sarah's mind raced. They were trapped in the small backyard, with only a wooden fence separating them from the neighboring properties. Thomas was in no condition to climb, and she couldn't leave him behind. Then she noticed something, a loose board in the fence, partially hidden behind Mrs. Chen's garden shed. If they could just reach it without being seen. She helped Thomas move slowly, staying low behind the plants and garden furniture. Every step seemed to take an eternity, and she could hear the men leaving the house through the front door, their footsteps on the porch thunderously loud in her ears. Just as they reached the fence, Sarah heard the back door open. Heart pounding, she quickly worked the loose board free, creating a space just big enough to squeeze through. She could hear voices getting closer as she helped. Thomas through the gap. On the other side of the fence was an overgrown lot, filled with tall grass and wildflowers, perfect for hiding but difficult to traverse. Sarah supported Thomas as best she could, knowing they had to put as much distance between themselves and their pursuers as possible. They moved slowly through the grass, trying to stay low and quiet. Behind them, Sarah could hear angry voices and the sound of the fence being checked. They needed somewhere to hide, somewhere safe where Thomas could rest and she could figure out their next move. As they emerged from the overgrown lot onto another residential street, Sarah spotted an old church, its weathered stone walls offering the promise of sanctuary. Thomas was barely conscious now, his body burning with fever, yet still he clutched at the front of his shirt, protecting something. Hidden there. Just a little further, Sarah whispered, as much to herself as to Thomas. We're almost there. But as she helped him toward the church steps, she couldn't shake the feeling that their escape had been too easy. Something about the way those men had searched the house. It was almost as if they had expected not to find them there. As if this was all part of some larger plan. The church's heavy wooden doors creaked as Sarah pushed them open, the sound echoing in the empty sanctuary. The afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colorful shadows across the worn wooden pews. Sarah helped Thomas to a bench near the back, where they would be hidden from view but could still watch the entrance. Rest here, she whispered, helping him lie down. I'll find someone who can help. But Thomas grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. Trust no one, he rasped. Richard has people everywhere, the company isn't what people think it is. His words were interrupted by a fit of coughing that left him gasping for air. Sarah pulled out the notebook she had taken from his wheelchair, studying its worn cover. What's in here? She asked. What did your brother do? Thomas's eyes darted around the empty church before he spoke. Evidence, financial records, proof of what he's been doing with company funds. Another coughing fit cut him off. The sound of a door opening somewhere in the church made them both freeze. Footsteps echoed through the sanctuary, getting closer. Sarah crouched, lower, ready to run, but Thomas's condition made quick escape impossible. Hello? A gentle voice called out. Is someone there? I heard coughing. An elderly man in priest's clothing appeared from behind a pillar. His kind face showed only concern as he took in the scene before him. A young girl and a clearly ill man hiding in his church. Please, Sarah said, stepping slightly in front of Thomas protectively. We need help, but we can't go to the hospital. There are people looking for us. The priest approached slowly, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. I'm Father Michael, he said softly. The church has always been a sanctuary for those in need. He looked more closely at Thomas and his eyes widened in recognition. Mr. Blackwood. Thomas Blackwood. Thomas nodded weakly. You know who I am. I've followed the news about your company, Father Michael replied, and I've had my suspicions about what happened to you. The story about you having a mental breakdown never seemed right. He helped them move to a small office behind the sanctuary, locking the door behind them. You'll be safer here, he said, pulling out a first aid kit. I have some medical training from my time as a military chaplain. As Father Michael examined Thomas, Sarah kept watch through a narrow window, her mind racing. The priest seemed genuinely willing to help, but Thomas's warning about trusting no one echoed in her thoughts. These marks, Father Michael said, gravely, examining the purple discoloration on Thomas's skin. They're consistent with thallium poisoning. It's rare, but I saw similar cases during my service. Someone's been poisoning you systematically. Thomas nodded weakly. My medicine. Richard replaced it. Been happening for months. Didn't realize until too late. Father Michael's face hardened. We need to get you real medical help, but I understand why you can't go to the hospital. I might know someone who can help. A doctor who runs a free Clinic on the other side of town. She asks no questions and keeps no records. Sarah watched the interaction carefully, noting how Thomas seemed to relax slightly in the priest's presence. Still, she couldn't shake her unease. How do we know we can trust this doctor? Because, Father Michael said quietly, she's the one who first raised concerns about the suspicious number of homeless people who disappeared after being offered jobs at Blackwood Industries. She's been trying to investigate, but no one would listen. Thomas struggled to sit up. The employment program, he whispered. It was supposed to help people, but Richard, he turned it into something else. The money, the missing people, it's all connected. A sudden noise from the sanctuary made them all fall silent. The main doors had opened again, and multiple sets of footsteps could be heard entering the church. Father Michael moved quickly, opening a hidden door behind his bookshelf. The church was part of the Underground Railroad, he explained quietly. These passages still work. There's a tunnel that leads to the clinic. Sarah, can you help Mr. Blackwood? She nodded, already moving to support Thomas. The priest handed her a small flashlight and a piece of paper with an address written on it. When you get to the end of the tunnel, look for a blue door with a caduceus symbol, he instructed. Tell them Father Michael sent you. I'll hold them off here. As Sarah helped Thomas into the dark passage, she heard Father Michael's voice, echoing in the sanctuary, greeting the newcomers with calm authority. The hidden door closed behind them, plunging them into darkness broken only by the beam of the flashlight. The tunnel ahead stretched into blackness, carrying with it the musty smell of history and secrets. Sarah took a deep breath, tightened her grip on Thomas's arm, and began to move forward. Whatever awaited them at the end of this tunnel, she knew they had just taken another step deeper into a mystery that was growing more dangerous by the hour. The tunnel's damp walls seemed to close in around them as Sarah and Thomas made their slow progress through the darkness. The flashlight's beam created strange dancing shadows that made Sarah jump at every corner. The air was thick with the weight of centuries, and their footsteps echoed eerily off the stone walls. Thomas leaned heavily against her, his breathing becoming more labored with each step. They had to stop several times to let him rest, each pause filling Sarah with increasing anxiety about their pursuers above ground. "We need to take a break," Sarah finally said, helping Thomas sit against one of the tunnel walls. In the flashlight's glow, she could see that the purple marks had spread further across his neck. "Sarah," Thomas wheezed, pulling something from inside his shirt, a small silver locket on a chain. "Take this. Keep it safe." His trembling hands pressed it into her palm. Inside, there's a key. It opens a safety deposit box. Box 247 at First National. She slipped the chain around her neck, tucking the locket beneath her shirt. What's in the box? Evidence, more than what's in the notebook. Proof of everything Richard's done. Thomas's voice was getting weaker. "But there's something else. Something about your..." A distant sound echoed through the tunnel, cutting him off. Both of them froze, listening intently. It could have been rats or the settling of old stones, but Sarah wasn't willing to take that chance. "We need to keep moving," she whispered, helping Thomas to his feet. The effort seemed to drain what little strength he had left, but they pressed on. The tunnel branched several times, but Sarah kept following Father Michael's instructions, always taking the path that led east. After what felt like hours, they finally saw a faint blue glow ahead, the caduceus symbol they'd been told to look for. The door was heavy steel, its paint peeling, but the medical symbol still clearly visible under a dim bulb. Sarah knocked, trying to control her trembling hands. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then a small viewing panel slid open and a pair of sharp eyes peered out at them. "Who sent you?" "Father Michael," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Please, we need help." The panel closed, and Sarah heard the sound of multiple locks being undone. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing a lab coat over casual clothes. "I'm Dr. Helen Martinez," she said, quickly ushering them inside. "Father Michael called ahead. Come quickly." The clinic was a surprising contrast to the tunnel, clean, well-lit and modern, despite its obviously limited resources. Dr. Martinez led them through a maze of corridors to a small examination room, helping Sarah get Thomas onto the bed. As the doctor began examining Thomas, Sarah noticed something odd about the clinic's layout. Beyond the main treatment areas, there seemed to be a whole separate section, hidden behind secure doors with keypads. "Your friend is suffering from severe thallium poisoning," Dr. Martinez announced after completing her examination. "I can start treatment, but he needs specialized care. The problem is, every hospital in the region is watching for him." "How? Do you know that?" Sarah asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. Dr. Martinez's expression hardened. "Because I've been tracking Blackwood Industries' activities for the past year. They've infiltrated every major medical facility in the area." She turned to Thomas. "Your brother's reach is extensive." Thomas nodded weakly. "The company, it's just a front now. Richard, he's been using it to—" Another coughing fit interrupted him. "Save your strength," Dr. Martinez said, preparing an IV. "I know more than you might think. I've been gathering evidence about the employment program, about the missing people, about the shell companies, but I could never prove the connection to Richard Blackwood." Sarah fingered the locket beneath her shirt, remembering the safety deposit box Thomas had mentioned. "Maybe we can help with that." A sudden commotion from somewhere in the clinic made them all tense. Dr. Martinez quickly moved to the door, listening intently. The sound of voices and footsteps was getting closer. "They've found the tunnel," she said grimly. "We need to move you. There's another way out through the secure ward." As they helped Thomas up, Sarah caught a glimpse through the door's window into the secure area. What she saw made her stop in her tracks. Rows of beds occupied by people in various states of treatment, all showing the same purple marks that covered Thomas's skin. "They're all poisoning victims," Dr. Martinez explained, following Sarah's gaze. "Former employees of Blackwood Industries, the ones we managed to save. The ones your brother couldn't silence," she added, looking at Thomas. The footsteps were getting closer. Dr. Martinez quickly punched a code into the keypad, opening the secure door. "Through here," she urged. "There's a service elevator that leads to a parking garage. My car is there. I can get you somewhere safe." As they hurried through the secure ward, Sarah couldn't help but look at the faces of the other patients. Each one represented a life destroyed by Richard Blackwood's schemes. But there was something else, something about one of the faces that tugged at her memory, though she couldn't quite place why. The service elevator groaned as it carried them up to the parking garage, its aged machinery protesting every floor. Dr. Martinez stood protectively in front of Thomas and Sarah, her body tense as she watched the floor numbers slowly increase. "My car is in the far corner," she whispered. "Terre-to-y. Stay close to the walls and move quickly." The elevator doors opened to reveal a dimly lit concrete structure. The air was thick with exhaust fumes and the musty smell of underground parking. Their footsteps echoed despite their attempts at stealth, each sound making Sarah wince. They were halfway to Dr. Martinez's car when a voice called out from behind them, "I'm afraid this is as far as you go." They turned to find a man in an expensive suit stepping out from behind a concrete pillar. His face bore a striking resemblance to Thomas's, though his features were harder, colder. Richard Blackwood. "Hello, brother," he said, his voice carrying the same smooth tone Sarah had heard at the Cheen's house. "You've led us on quite a chase." More men emerged from the shadows surrounding them. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, placing herself between Richard and his targets. "This ends now, Blackwood. I have proof of everything you've done." Richard's laugh was chilling. "My dear doctor, you have nothing. Just like all the others who tried to interfere." He glanced at the other men. "Take them." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Dr. Martinez reached into her lab coat, pulling out what looked like a remote control. She pressed a button, and suddenly the garage was filled with the sound of screeching tires. 3 vans burst through different entrances of the parking garage, their headlights blazing. From them emerged dozens of people, some in police uniforms, others in FBI jackets. "Actually," Dr. Martinez said, her voice steady, "we have everything. including your brother's testimony and the evidence he's been gathering for months. Richard's composed facade cracked slightly. You're bluffing. You have nothing concrete. We have the financial records, a new voice called out. Mr. Chen stepped forward from behind one of the vans, holding up a familiar notebook. Everything documented in detail. We have witnesses, Mrs. Chen added, emerging beside her husband. All the people you tried to silence, the ones Dr. Martinez saved. Richard's face contorted with rage. You think this changes anything? I still control the company. It's my word against a bunch of street rats and a rogue doctor. And me, Thomas said, his voice weak but clear. Your own brother, whom you've been poisoning slowly, hoping to make it look like a natural deterioration. Did you use the same method on Julia Morgan? The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Julia Morgan. Why did that name feel so important? Richard's expression changed, becoming almost pitying. Ah, so you finally figured it out. Poor Julia. She was so determined to protect her little girl, to expose what she'd discovered about the company. Such a shame about her accident. Sarah's world tilted on its axis. Julia Morgan. The face she'd seen in the secure ward that had seemed so familiar. It was like looking in a mirror, but older. A face she'd seen only in her dreams and in a worn photograph she kept in her pocket. My mother, she whispered, the pieces finally falling into place. You knew my mother. Thomas reached for her hand, his eyes filled with tears. Sarah, I've been searching for you for so long. Julia, she was my best friend, my head of security. When she discovered what Richard was doing with the company, she tried to stop him. The night she disappeared, she left something in my care, evidence, and a letter telling me about her daughter. Richard's laugh was harsh. How touching. The lost little princess returns, but it changes nothing. You have no proof that I had anything to do with Julia's unfortunate accident. That's where you're wrong, Dr. Martinez interrupted. She pulled out a phone, playing a video. On the screen, a security camera footage showed a younger Richard Blackwood in what appeared to be a heated argument with Julia Morgan. The timestamp showed it was from the night she disappeared. Found this in your private server, Dr. Martinez said, along with emails, bank transfers, and records of all your other accidents. The FBI has been building this case for months. We just needed Thomas's evidence to complete the puzzle. The sound of handcuffs clicking echoed through the garage as FBI agents moved in. Richard's composed facade finally shattered completely, his face contorting with rage as he was led away. Sarah stood frozen, overwhelmed by the revelations. Thomas squeezed her hand gently. Your mother was the bravest person I knew, he said softly. She made me promise to find you, to keep you safe. I've been looking for you ever since, but Richard's people always kept you hidden, moving you from one foster home to another. Dr. Martinez stepped forward. We need to get Thomas to the hospital now. The antidote needs to be administered properly. She looked at Sarah kindly. There's much more to discuss, but right now, let's focus on helping him recover. As they helped Thomas toward one of the waiting ambulances, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The locket around her neck seemed to pulse with the weight of its secrets, but for the first time, she wasn't alone in carrying them. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors and the soft hum of medical equipment. Sarah sat in a chair beside Thomas's bed, watching as the antidote dripped slowly through his IV. The purple marks on his skin had begun to fade, though the doctors said it would take weeks for the poison to completely leave his system. Through the window, she could see FBI agents stationed in the hallway, ensuring no one unauthorized could enter. Dr. Martinez had pulled strings to get them a private wing of the hospital, away from prying eyes and potential threats. You should get some rest, Thomas said softly, noticing the dark circles under Sarah's eyes. She hadn't left his side since they arrived 2 days ago. Sarah shook her head, fingering the locket that still hung around her neck. I want to know more about my mother, about everything. Thomas shifted in his bed, his movements still weak but steadier than before. Julia was brilliant, he began, his eyes distant with memory. She started as a security consultant but quickly became one of our most trusted employees. She was the one who first noticed discrepancies in the company's employment program. What kind of discrepancies? Sarah asked, leaning forward. Money that couldn't be accounted for, people who disappeared after being hired. At first, we thought it was just poor record-keeping, but Julia dug deeper. She discovered that Richard had created a network of shell companies using the employment program as a cover for something much darker. A knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Martinez entered, accompanied by Mrs. Chen, who carried a cardboard box. "We found this in Richard's private office," Dr. Martinez explained. "It was hidden in a false bottom of his desk. Drawer." She placed the box on Thomas's bed tray. Inside were photographs, letters, and documents. Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up a photo of a woman, with her same dark hair and green eyes, smiling at the camera while holding a small child. "That was taken at the company picnic," Thomas said softly. "About a month before everything happened. Julia had just told me she'd discovered proof of Richard's crimes. She was going to take it to the authorities." Mrs. Chen placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Your mother was trying to protect you. When she realized how dangerous Richard was, she made arrangements to get you to safety." "But something went wrong," Sarah whispered, the pieces of her past finally coming together. Thomas nodded grimly. "Richard found out the night Julia disappeared. She had managed to copy crucial files and financial records. She hid them in a safety deposit box, but Richard's people were closing in. She barely had time to get you to a trusted friend before..." He trailed off, but Sarah understood. Her earliest memories suddenly made more sense. Being hurried through dark streets, a tearful goodbye, promises that they'd be together again soon. "Richard's people found you anyway," Thomas continued. "They made sure you were kept in the system, moved frequently enough that I could never track you down. But Julia, she left me a letter telling me about you, asking me to keep looking." Sarah pulled out the worn photograph she always carried, the only link to her past she'd had all these years. "This was in my pocket the night I was taken to the first foster home. I never knew where it came from." "Julia put it there," Mrs. Chen said softly. "She wanted you to have something to remember her by." Dr. Martinez stepped forward holding a file. "We've been going through Richard's records. The employment program was just the tip of the iceberg. He was using the company to launder money for some very dangerous people. When Julia threatened to expose him, he didn't just silence her. He took control of the entire company. But he made mistakes," Thomas added. "Got sloppy. When I started asking questions about Julia's disappearance, about the missing funds, he panicked, started poisoning me slowly, making it look like I was having a mental breakdown so he could take control." Sarah looked at the locket around her neck. "And the safety deposit box, what's in it?" "Everything," Thomas said. "Financial records, surveillance footage, emails, all the evidence Julia collected, plus what I added over the years. Enough to expose not just Richard, but his entire network." Another knock at the door revealed an FBI agent. "Mr. Blackwood, we need to talk about your brother's associates. We're concerned some of them might try to silence potential witnesses." Dr. Martinez straightened. "I'll increase security at the clinic. Many of our patients are key witnesses." "The Chens need protection too," Sarah insisted, looking at Mrs. Chen with concern. "Already taken care of," the FBI agent assured them. "We have agents at their house and at the church with Father Michael." Thomas reached for Sarah's hand. "There's something else you should know. Julia left you more than just evidence. She left you her shares in the company, 15% of Blackwood Industries. Combined with my 40%, it gives us controlling interest." Sarah's mind reeled with the implications. After years of having nothing, of belonging nowhere, she suddenly had both a past and a future handed to her. "We can make it right," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger. "Clean up the company, use it the way it was meant to be used, to help people. That's what your mother wanted. It's her legacy, and now it's yours too." Sarah looked down at the photograph of her mother, at the smile that mirrored her own. For the first time, she felt the weight of not just her past, but her future. A future she never could have imagined when she first helped a stranger in the rain. The safety deposit box made a hollow sound as it slid out of the wall. Sarah stood in the bank's private viewing room, flanked by FBI agents, while Thomas waited outside with Dr. Martinez. Her hands shook slightly as she inserted the key from the locket. Inside the box were several USB drives, a thick manila envelope, and a sealed letter with her name written in elegant handwriting. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, her mother's handwriting. "Take your time," the female FBI agent said kindly, stepping back to give her privacy. Sarah opened the letter first, unfolding pages that had waited years to be read. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, but Thomas has finally found you. I'm so sorry I had to leave you, but I had no choice. What I discovered at Blackwood Industries goes deeper than anyone suspects. Richard isn't just stealing money, he's destroying lives. The employment program was designed to help people get back on their feet, but he turned it into something horrific. He's been using it to identify people no one would miss, forcing them to participate in illegal clinical trials for experimental drugs. I've included all the evidence: bank records showing payments to offshore accounts, emails discussing the disposal of failed test subjects, and security footage from the secret labs. But most importantly, I've included proof of his ultimate plan to take control of the company by slowly poisoning his own brother. Sarah, my brave girl, I know this is a heavy burden to place on you, but you have your father's strength and my determination. Yes, your father. There's something else you need to know. Thomas isn't just my best friend. He's your uncle. Your father was James Blackwood, Thomas and Richard's eldest brother. James discovered Richard's early experiments years ago, before you were born. He tried to stop it, but Richard arranged an accident. Everyone thought James abandoned the company and ran away. Only I knew the truth, and when I found the evidence, Richard realized I was a threat. The shares I left you aren't just about money or power. They're about justice. For James, for all the people Richard has hurt, and for the company that was meant to help people. Thomas will help you understand everything. Trust him and trust yourself. Remember that I love you, always and forever. You were my greatest joy, my strongest reason for fighting. Now it's your turn to fight. All my love, Mom. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she finished reading. The FBI agents were already examining the USB drives, their faces grim as they discovered the extent of Richard's crimes. A soft knock at the door preceded Thomas's entrance. One look at Sarah's face told him she'd read the letter. "You know about James now," he said quietly. She nodded, unable to speak. Thomas pulled her into a gentle hug, mindful of his still healing body. "Your father was the best of us," he said. "Richard was always jealous of him, of his integrity and vision for the company. When James disappeared, I suspected Richard, but I could never prove it." "All these years," Sarah whispered, "I thought I was alone, but I had family, I had a heritage." "You have more than that," Dr. Martinez said from the doorway. "You have a future. The evidence in those drives, it's not just about Richard. It exposes an entire network of corporate corruption. People are already coming forward, whistleblowers from other companies involved in the illegal trials." The female FBI agent looked up from her laptop. "Ms. Morgan, or should I say Ms. Blackwood, we're going to need your help. As a major shareholder and victim of these crimes, your testimony will be crucial." Sarah straightened, feeling the weight of her mother's letter in her hands. "I'll do whatever it takes, but first, we need to help the people Richard hurt. The employment program. We need to find everyone who went through it. Make sure they're safe." Thomas smiled proudly. "That's exactly what your father would have said. And I know just where to start. The clinic's records combined with the company's files, we can track down most of them." "The Chens can help too," Sarah added. "They know everyone in the community, all the people who disappeared over the years. And Father Michael, his church must have records of people who came seeking help." Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. "We'll need to set up a proper medical facility, somewhere safe for the victims to recover and receive treatment. The clinic's getting too small for all the patients we've been finding." "The company owns several properties," Thomas said, "including a former rehabilitation center just outside the city. It's perfect. Secluded but accessible. We can convert it into a proper treatment facility. Sarah looked around at these people who had become her unlikely family. Thomas, her uncle who never stopped searching for her. Dr. Martinez, who risked everything to save lives. The Chens, who opened their home to a stranger in need. She thought of her mother's courage, her father's integrity, and felt their strength flowing through her. "We're going to rebuild everything," she said firmly. "Not just the company, but all the lives Richard tried to destroy. We'll make it what it was always meant to be, a force for good." Through the bank's windows, she could see the sun rising over the city skyline. A new day, a new beginning. And for the first time in her life, Sarah knew exactly where she belonged. The former rehabilitation center sprawled across 10 acres of carefully maintained grounds, its red brick buildings partially hidden behind mature oak trees. Sarah stood at the main entrance, watching as construction crews worked to transform the facility. In just 2 weeks, it would become the Blackwood Recovery Center, a safe haven for the victims of Richard's schemes. "The East Wing renovations are ahead of schedule," Dr. Martinez reported, walking up with a clipboard in hand. "We should be able to move the first patients from the clinic by next week." Sarah nodded, studying the architectural plans spread out on a nearby table. The facility would include not only medical treatment areas, but also counseling centers, job training facilities, and temporary housing for those who needed it. "How are the security measures coming along?" she asked, thinking of the threats they still faced. Though Richard was in custody, many of his associates remained at large. "State of the art," a familiar voice answered. Sarah turned to see Mr. Chen approaching, accompanied by a team of security consultants. After everything that happened, he had offered to oversee the facility's protection personally. "We're installing a biometric access system, and I have former military personnel training our security staff." Mrs. Chen, who had taken charge of the housing arrangements, joined them with her own set of plans. "We've modified the residential units to accommodate families. Some of Richard's victims have children. They need to stay together during recovery." The sound of helicopter blades interrupted their discussion. A sleek corporate helicopter descended onto the newly constructed helipad, bearing the reformed Blackwood Industries logo. Thomas emerged from it looking stronger than he had in weeks. His recovery was progressing well, though he still needed a cane to walk. "The board meeting went better than expected," he announced as he joined them. "Most of the directors were horrified when they learned the truth about Richard's activities. They've unanimously approved our restructuring plan." Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The past month had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, corporate restructuring, and planning for the recovery center. Sometimes it still felt surreal. The street girl who had once hidden from the world was now helping to reshape a major corporation. "There's something else," Thomas added, his expression serious. "We found more of Richard's files, encrypted, data hidden in overseas servers. Your mother, she wasn't the only whistleblower he silenced. There were others, going back years." "How many?" Sarah asked, her heart heavy. "Dozens. Some disappeared, some were discredited, some were forced into silence. But they left trails, evidence, testimonies, warnings. We're finding their families making things right." Father Michael, who had arrived to discuss the center's counseling programs, stepped forward. "Many of these families have been living in fear for years. They need more than just compensation, they need healing." "That's exactly what this place is about," Sarah replied, looking around at the facility taking shape before them. "Not just treating the physical effects of what Richard did, but helping people rebuild their lives." A commotion at the main gate drew their attention. A group of people was gathering there. Former employees, victims' families, community, members who had lost loved ones to Richard's schemes. Word had spread about the recovery center, and people were coming forward, seeking help or offering support. "They need to see it's real," Dr. Martinez said softly. "That things are actually changing." Sarah straightened her shoulders and walked toward the gate. As she approached, she recognized some of the faces from the files they'd uncovered. A woman whose husband had disappeared after joining the employment program, a former accountant who had been threatened into silence, a security guard who had tried to report suspicious activities. "Welcome," she said, opening the gate. "Please come in. We have a lot to talk about." The group entered cautiously, their eyes taking in the construction activity and the new signs announcing the facility's purpose. Sarah led them to a newly completed conference room where they could share their stories and learn about the help available to them. As she listened to their experiences, Sarah felt her mother's presence strongly. These were the people Julia Morgan had tried to protect, the ones she had given her life to save. Now her daughter was finishing what she had started. Thomas joined them, leaning on his cane as he addressed the group. Blackwood Industries was founded with a mission to help people build better lives. We lost our way for a while, but we're returning to that mission. This facility is just the beginning. A woman in the front row raised her hand, her voice trembling. "My daughter. She went through the employment program 2 years ago. We haven't heard from her since. Can you help us find her?" Sarah exchanged glances with Mr. Chen and Dr. Martinez. They had anticipated this, had already begun creating a database of missing persons connected to the company. "Yes," Sarah said firmly. "We're going to find everyone, and we're going to make sure nothing like this ever happens again." As the meeting continued, Sarah noticed Mrs. Chen talking quietly with some of the families, Father Michael offering comfort to those who were struggling, and Dr. Martinez taking notes on medical histories. They had become more than just allies. They were a team, united in their determination to heal the wounds Richard had inflicted. Through the conference room windows, Sarah could see the sun setting. Behind the oak trees, casting long shadows across the grounds, the facility was coming alive with purpose, each brick and beam infused with the promise of renewal. It wasn't just a building taking shape. It was hope being rebuilt, one story at a time. The autumn breeze rustled through the oak trees as Sarah sat on a bench in the recovery center's newly completed garden. 3 months had passed since they'd opened the facility, and already it had become a sanctuary for dozens of families affected by Richard's crimes. She watched as a group of children played on the recently installed playground equipment, their laughter carrying across the grounds. Most of them were staying at the center with their parents, families reunited after years of separation caused by Richard's schemes. "Quite a change from that rainy night, isn't it?" Thomas said, joining her on the bench. His health had improved significantly, though he still moved carefully. The doctors said the lasting effects of the poison would take time to fully fade. Sarah smiled, thinking back to the moment she'd found him in his wheelchair, never imagining how that single act of kindness would transform both their lives. "Sometimes, I still can't believe all of this is real. Your mother would be proud," Thomas said softly. "Not just of what you've built here, but of who you've become." Before Sarah could respond, Mrs. Chen approached with a young woman Sarah had never seen before. The newcomer's hands twisted nervously in front of her, her eyes darting around as if searching for escape routes. "This is Angela," Mrs. Chen introduced gently. "She just arrived. She was part of the employment program 2 years ago." Sarah stood, recognizing the signs of someone who had been through trauma. "Welcome to Blackwood Recovery Center," she said warmly. "You're safe here." Angela's eyes filled with tears. "I never thought, when they took us to those labs, made us take those drugs, I thought no one would ever know what happened to us." "Would you like to tell us your story?" Sarah asked, gesturing to the bench. "Whatever you're comfortable sharing." As Angela spoke, Sarah took notes. Each survivor's testimony helped them piece together more of Richard's network, identifying more people who needed help and those who needed to be brought to justice. "There was a nurse," Angela recalled, her voice strengthening. "She tried to help us. She kept records of what they were doing, but then she disappeared." Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances. Another whistleblower, another life Richard had tried to silence. "We'll find her," Sarah promised. "We're building a database of everyone connected to the program. Dr. Martinez's team is working with law enforcement to track down all the victims and witnesses." A commotion near the main building caught their attention. A group of people was gathering around a newly arrived family, a mother and 2 children who looked overwhelmed by the attention. That's Lisa Monroe, Mrs. Chen explained quickly. The woman Angela just told us about. Her daughter was in the employment program. She's been searching for her for 3 years. They watched as Angela looked up, recognition dawning on her face. Emily, she called out, standing suddenly. Emily Monroe? One of the children turned, her eyes widening. Angie, you're alive! The two rushed to embrace each other, their tears of joy causing several onlookers to wipe their own eyes. Sarah felt Thomas squeeze her hand as they witnessed another family being reunited. This is what healing looks like, Father Michael said, appearing beside them. Not just medical treatment or counseling, but moments like these. People finding each other, discovering they're not alone. Sarah nodded, thinking of all the files still waiting to be processed, all the families still searching for answers. The work was far from over, but moments like this made it all worthwhile. Dr. Martinez joined them, her face alight with excitement. The new treatment protocol is showing promising results, she reported. The patients who were subjected to Richard's experimental drugs are responding well to the detox program, and the support groups are helping them deal with the psychological trauma. And the legal team? Thomas asked. Making progress. The evidence from Richard's servers has led to arrests in 3 countries. His network is crumbling. Sarah excused herself and walked to the center's memorial garden, where a simple plaque honored those who had lost their lives to Richard's schemes. Her mother's name was there, along with her father's and countless others. We're doing it. Mom, she whispered, touching the cool metal of the plaque. We're making things right. The sound of children's laughter floated over from the playground, mixing with the rustling leaves and distant conversations. The recovery center had become more than just a facility. It was a community, a place of healing and hope. Sarah turned back toward the main building, where Angela and Emily were still embracing, surrounded by their families. Mrs. Chen was already organizing rooms for the newcomers, while Father Michael spoke quietly with those who needed spiritual comfort. Thomas watched his niece with pride as she walked back to join them. In just a few months, she had grown from a street-smart survivor into a confident young woman, carrying on her parents' legacy of compassion and justice. The sun was setting behind the oak trees, casting warm, golden light across the grounds. Another day of healing was ending at Blackwood Recovery Center, but tomorrow would bring new challenges, new survivors to help, new wounds to heal. And they would face it all together, as a family bound not by blood alone, but by their shared commitment to making the world a little bit better, one life at a time. The boardroom of Blackwood Industries felt different now. Gone were the cold, sterile furnishings Richard had preferred, replaced with warmer tones and comfortable seating. Sarah sat at the head of the table, reviewing quarterly reports with Thomas and the new board members. The transition is going better than expected, the financial director reported. Our legitimate operations are showing strong growth, and employee morale has improved significantly since the changes were implemented. Sarah nodded, but her attention was drawn to a thick folder Dr. Martinez had just placed on the table. What's this? More records from Richard's private archives, Dr. Martinez explained, her expression grave. These were hidden in a secondary server we just discovered. They go back further than we thought, all the way to when your father was running the company. Thomas leaned forward, his face tightening with concern. What did you find? Doctor. Martinez opened the folder, revealing photographs and documents yellowed with age. James wasn't just trying to stop Richard's early experiments. He was investigating something bigger, a pattern of suspicious acquisitions and shell companies dating back to the company's founding. Sarah picked up one of the photographs. It showed a group of men standing in front of an old building, their faces serious as they posed for the camera. She recognized her grandfather, Anthony Blackwood, standing in the center. That was taken in 1962, Thomas said softly, when Father first expanded the company into pharmaceuticals. He pointed to one of the other men in the photo. That's Victor Lancaster. He was Father's biggest investor. Dr. Martinez spread out more documents. According to these records, Lancaster Industries was involved in unauthorized medical testing back in the 1960s. When they were about to be exposed, Anthony Blackwood bought the company and buried the evidence. But why would grandfather do that? Sarah asked, her world tilting again with new revelations. Because, Thomas replied, his voice heavy, Lancaster had something on him. Something that could have destroyed everything he'd built. He reached for another document, his hands trembling slightly. James must have discovered this when he took over as CEO. That's why he started investigating the old records. A knock at the door interrupted them. Mr. Chen entered, looking troubled. We found something at the recovery center. During the renovation of the East Wing, workers discovered a hidden room. It contains files, decades of them. They quickly relocated to the recovery center, where a team of FBI agents was already cataloging the discovered documents. The hidden room was small, its walls lined with filing cabinets that looked like they hadn't been opened in years. These records, an FBI agent explained, they're all connected. Lancaster Industries, the pharmaceutical division, the employment program, it was all part of a larger pattern. Unauthorized experiments, covered-up accidents, silenced witnesses. Richard didn't start this, he just continued what was already in place. Sarah felt her chest tighten as she realized the implications. The company's success, it was built on suffering, on silence. But that doesn't have to be its future, Thomas said firmly. James tried to change things, to make it right. That's why Richard targeted him. And now we have the chance to finish what he started. Dr. Martinez picked up a dusty file. Some of these victims might still be alive, or their families. They deserve to know the truth. And they deserve compensation, Sarah added. We need to set up a fund, reach out to everyone affected by this, going back as far as we can trace. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Mrs. Chen appeared, accompanied by an elderly man who looked vaguely familiar to Sarah. This is David Lancaster, Mrs. Chen introduced. Victor Lancaster's son. He's been following our progress in the news. David stepped forward, his eyes taking in the room full of evidence. I've spent years trying to expose what my father and Anthony Blackwood did, he said, but they were too powerful, had too many connections. When I heard about what you're doing here, he turned to Sarah. Your father reached out to me, you know, just before he disappeared. He wanted my help to make things right. Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes. Another piece of her father's legacy, another connection to the truth he had tried to reveal. Will you help us now? She asked. We need to understand everything that happened, make amends to everyone who was hurt. David nodded, pulling out a USB drive from his pocket. I have my own records, everything I've gathered over the years. Names, dates, locations, people who were silenced, families who were paid off. Thomas placed a supportive hand on Sarah's shoulder. This isn't just about exposing the past, he said. It's about changing the future, making sure these crimes can never happen again. Sarah looked around at the room full of evidence, at the faces of those committed to uncovering the truth. The recovery center had become more than just a place of healing. It was becoming a center for justice, for transformation. We'll need to expand the facility, she said, her mind already working on solutions. Create a dedicated research center to study the long-term effects of those unauthorized trials. Help the survivors and their families understand what was done to them. And we'll need to strengthen our security, Mr. Chen added. There are still people out there who want these secrets to stay buried. Sarah stood straighter, feeling the weight of her family's legacy, both its darkness and its potential for light. Then we'll shine a brighter light. No more shadows, no more secrets. We'll face everything that happened and make it right, no matter how long it takes. The Recovery Center's new research wing buzzed with activity as Dr. Martinez led Sarah through the state-of-the-art laboratories. 6 months had passed since the discovery of the hidden records, and they had made significant progress in understanding the full scope of the company's past activities. We've identified 3 distinct periods of unauthorized testing, Dr. Martinez explained, pointing to a timeline displayed on a large screen. The Lancaster era in the 1960s, the transition period under Anthony Blackwood, and Richard's recent activities. Each had its own signature, its own way of hiding the evidence. Sarah studied the data, noting the patterns that emerged. And the survivors? How are they responding to the new treatments? Better than we hoped. The combination of medical intervention and psychological support is showing remarkable results. Even some of the oldest cases are seeing improvement. They moved to the rehabilitation area, where physical therapists worked with patients recovering from years of experimental drug exposure. Sarah recognized Angela among them, now serving as a peer counselor for new arrivals. "Sarah," Angela called out, waving them over. "Remember Emily, the girl we reunited with her family? She's starting college next month. The educational support program you set up made it possible." These were the moments that made everything worthwhile, seeing lives rebuilt, dreams rekindled. The recovery center had grown beyond their initial vision, becoming a model for rehabilitation and corporate responsibility that other companies were beginning to emulate. Thomas joined them, accompanied by David Lancaster and a group of international healthcare officials. "The United Nations is interested in our program," he announced. "They want to use our protocols as a template for handling similar cases worldwide." "It's more than that," David added. "What you've done here, exposing corporate abuse, providing real help to victims, creating systemic change, it's unprecedented. Other companies are being forced to confront their own dark histories." Sarah led the group to the center's newest addition, a memorial garden expanded to include a museum documenting the company's history, both its achievements and its crimes. The walls were lined with photographs and stories of survivors, ensuring that the truth would never again be buried. "Your father would be proud," David said softly, as they stood before a display about James Blackwood's efforts to reform the company. He believed that corporations had a responsibility to do more than just make money. They had to make the world better. A commotion near the entrance caught their attention. Mrs. Chen was welcoming a new group of arrivals, families who had just learned the truth about what happened to their loved ones decades ago. "Every week more people come forward," she explained, joining them. "The outreach program is working. People are finally feeling safe enough to tell their stories." Mr. Chen appeared with updated security reports. "The FBI task force has made more arrests," he reported. "Former executives, doctors who participated in the trials, people who helped cover up the evidence. The network is crumbling." Sarah watched as the new arrivals were guided through the intake process, their faces showing a mixture of fear, hope, and relief. Each person who walked through those doors was a testament to the power of truth and healing. "We're not just helping the victims," Dr. Martinez observed. "We're changing how corporate accountability works, the legal precedents we're setting, the rehabilitation protocols we're developing. They'll help people long after we're gone." Thomas smiled, looking around at what they had built. "This is what redemption looks like," he said, "not just acknowledging past wrongs, but actively working to make them right." Sarah touched the locket she still wore around her neck, thinking of her mother's courage, her father's vision, and all the people who had fought to expose the truth over the years. Their legacy lived on in every person helped, every life restored. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez said, leading them to her office. "We've been analyzing the old research data, looking for patterns. Some of those early experiments, despite their unethical nature, yielded important medical insights. We think we can use that knowledge ethically now to develop new treatments." "You mean we can take something good from all this?" Sarah asked, hope rising in her chest. "More than that. We can transform decades of suffering into solutions that help people. Real medical advances, developed ethically and made accessible to everyone." As they discussed the possibilities, Sarah gazed out the window at the grounds of the recovery center. Children played on the playground while their parents attended therapy sessions. Former victims worked alongside medical professionals, their experiences helping to guide treatment for others. The cycle of trauma was being transformed into a circle of healing. "This is just the beginning," she said softly, thinking of all the work still ahead. "But for the first time, I truly believe we can make things right." Winter had settled over the recovery center, dusting the oak trees with snow and turning the grounds into a serene white landscape. Sarah stood in her new office at Blackwood Industries, watching snowflakes drift past the window while she reviewed the latest progress reports. The past year had transformed not just the company, but Sarah herself. The street-smart survival skills that had once kept her alive now helped her navigate corporate boardrooms and policy meetings, yet she never forgot where she came from. Her office door was always open to anyone seeking help. "Ms. Blackwood," her assistant called from the doorway. "The international delegation has arrived for the tour." Sarah smiled at the formal use of her family name, still not entirely used to it. "Thank you, Jenny, and please, I've told you, it's just Sarah." The delegation consisted of healthcare officials and corporate ethics experts from around the world. They had come to study the Blackwood model of corporate rehabilitation and victim support, hoping to implement similar programs in their own countries. As Sarah led them through the company's main building, she couldn't help but notice how different it felt now. The cold, imposing atmosphere Richard had cultivated had been replaced with warmth and transparency. Glass walls had replaced solid ones, letting in natural light and creating a sense of openness. "Our first priority," Sarah explained to the IEG group, was changing the corporate culture. Every employee now knows they have not just the right but the responsibility to report ethical concerns. "And what about the psychological impact?" a visiting psychiatrist asked. "How do you help employees deal with the knowledge of the company's past?" "By facing it honestly," Thomas answered, joining the tour. He moved more easily now, though he still used a cane on difficult days. "We've made our history part of our training program. Every new employee learns about what happened and how we're working to make it right." The tour continued to the company's new research facility, where Dr. Martinez was overseeing the ethical development of medications based on the recovered data. "We've created a unique oversight system," Dr. Martinez explained. "Our research board includes not just scientists and ethics experts, but also survivors of the original experiments and their family members. Every decision we make must pass their scrutiny." In one of the labs, they met Angela, who had completed her medical training and now worked as a research coordinator. "Our focus is on helping people," she told the delegation. "Every breakthrough we make is immediately shared with other research facilities. No more patents, no more profit-driven research." A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. A group of excited researchers was gathered around a computer screen calling for Dr. Martinez. "We've done it," one of them announced as they approached. "The new treatment protocol, it's working. The long-term effects of the experimental drugs can be reversed." Sarah felt her heart leap. This was what they had been working toward, not just helping people cope with what had been done to them, but actually healing the damage. The delegation members crowded around, examining the data with professional interest. "This is remarkable," the psychiatrist commented. "The implications for treating other forms of chemical trauma." "We'll share everything," Sarah assured them. "The research, the protocols, the rehabilitation methods. That's our new mission, turning past wrongs into future solutions." Later that afternoon, Sarah visited the recovery center, where Mrs. Chen was organizing a winter celebration for the residents. The main hall had been decorated with lights and garlands, creating a festive atmosphere that seemed to lift everyone's spirits. "Look who's here," Mrs. Chen said, pointing to a familiar face in the crowd. It was Lisa Monroe, Emily's mother, now working as a patient advocate. She was helping a newly arrived family fill out their paperwork, her gentle manner putting them at ease. "Sometimes I still can't believe how much has changed," Lisa said, when she joined them. "A year ago, I was still searching for my daughter. Now she's in college and I'm helping other families rebuild their lives." Mr. Chen appeared with security updates. "The last of Richard's overseas accounts has been frozen," he reported. "The funds are being transferred to the Victim Compensation Program." Sarah nodded, thinking of all the families still waiting for help. The company's resources were vast, but so was the damage that needed to be repaired. "There's something else," Mr. Chen added, his expression serious. "We've received messages from employees at other companies, whistleblowers wanting to expose similar programs. They're reaching out because of what we've done here," Thomas said. They see that it's possible to face the truth and survive. To transform something broken into something healing. Sarah looked around at the recovery center, at the people who had become her family, at the work they were doing together. The scared little girl who had once hidden from the world was gone, replaced by someone who faced challenges head-on, who believed in the possibility of change. As evening fell, snow continued to drift past the windows, each flake catching the light like a tiny star. Inside, the sound of laughter and conversation filled the halls, the sound of healing, of hope, of lives being rebuilt one day at a time. The spring sun warmed Sarah's face as she walked through the recovery centers, gardens now bursting with new life. Flowers bloomed along the pathways, their colors bright against the fresh green grass. She paused at her favorite bench, the one where she often came to think and remember. Today was special, exactly 1 year since that rainy night when she had found Thomas in his wheelchair. 1 year since her life had changed forever. "I thought I'd find you here," Thomas said, joining her on the bench. Remembering. Sarah nodded, touching the locket that still hung around her neck. "I was thinking about Mom and Dad, about how everything they fought for is finally happening." "They would be amazed by what you've accomplished," Thomas replied. "What we've all accomplished together." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Martinez, who carried a tablet with the latest research results. "The new treatment has been approved," she announced excitedly. "The medical board was unanimous. We can begin offering it to all affected patients immediately." This was the breakthrough they had been working toward, a comprehensive treatment that could reverse the effects of decades of unauthorized experimentation. It represented hope for hundreds of families, including many who had given up on ever finding help. "There's more," Dr. Martinez continued. "The FBI task force just contacted us. They've located another group of survivors, people who were part of the earliest Lancaster trials. They've been in hiding for years, afraid to come forward." Sarah stood up, already planning. "We'll need to prepare rooms for them, arrange for medical evaluations. Are any of them in immediate danger?" "They're safe now," Mr. Chen said, approaching with his security team. "We've already dispatched a protection detail. They'll be here by tomorrow." The sound of children's laughter drew their attention to the playground, where a group of kids was helping to plant a new garden. Among them was a small girl who reminded Sarah of herself at that age, determined, resilient, finally finding a place to belong. "Jenny told me something interesting this morning," Thomas said, watching the children. "More companies are reaching out to us, wanting to learn from our example. Not just about handling past mistakes, but about creating ethical business practices for the future. The Blackwood model is becoming a standard," Dr. Martinez added. "Other corporations are establishing their own rehabilitation programs, transparency initiatives, victim support systems." Sarah smiled, remembering how impossible it had all seemed a year ago. "We're changing more than just our company. We're changing how business itself works." Mrs. Chen appeared, accompanied by Angela and Emily, who had come home from college for the weekend. "The new families are settling in well," she reported, "and the community outreach program is expanding. People who were afraid to speak up before are coming forward, offering to help." "It's like a ripple effect," Emily said. She had grown into a confident young woman, her past trauma transformed into a desire to help others. "Every person we help goes on to help someone else." Angela nodded, her eyes bright with purpose. "That's why I decided to specialize in trauma medicine. I want to be part of making sure nothing like this ever happens again." A gentle breeze rustled through the oak trees, carrying the scent of spring flowers. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself feel the full weight of everything that had changed. The scared little girl who had once hidden from the world had found not just a home, but a purpose. The street-smart survivor had become a leader, using her experiences to help others find their way out of darkness. "You know what today reminds me of?" Thomas asked softly. "That night in the rain. You could have walked away, left me there. But you didn't. You chose to help even though you had no idea where it would lead." Sarah looked around at the recovery center, at the lives being rebuilt, at the family she had found. "I think part of me knew," she said. "Not the details, but I knew something important was happening, that helping you was the right thing to do. One act of kindness, Mrs. Chen mused. That's all it takes sometimes, one person deciding to do the right thing, even when it's hard. Dr. Martinez checked her watch. The new families will be arriving soon, we should get ready. As the others moved to prepare for the newcomers, Sarah remained on the bench for a moment longer. She thought about her mother's courage, her father's integrity, and how their legacy lived on in every person helped, every life restored. The recovery center had become more than just a facility. It was a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of transformation. And Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more lives to help, more wrongs to right. But she was ready for them all, surrounded by her unlikely family, supported by their shared commitment to making the world a little bit better each day. The late afternoon sun filtered through the stained glass windows of Father Michael's church, casting rainbow patterns across the pews. Sarah sat in the back row watching as volunteers helped set up for tomorrow's support group meeting. The church had become an important partner in their healing program, offering spiritual guidance to those who sought it. It's amazing how things come full circle, Father Michael said, joining her. This is where you and Thomas found sanctuary that day, and now it's a sanctuary for so many others. Before Sarah could respond, Jenny rushed in, clutching a file. Sarah, you need to see this, she said, slightly out of breath. The archival team found something while digitizing the old Lancaster records. Sarah opened the file, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the photographs inside. They showed a young woman who looked remarkably like her mother, standing next to Victor Lancaster in what appeared to be a laboratory. That's Catherine Lancaster, Jenny explained. Victor's daughter. According to these records, she was a whistleblower too. She tried to expose her father's unethical experiments in the early days. Father Michael leaned in to look at the photos. I remember her, he said softly. She used to come to the church, asking for help in finding people who had disappeared after participating in medical trials. Then one day, she stopped coming. Sarah's hands trembled as she read through the documents. She didn't just disappear. She whispered. She went into hiding, and she helped others escape too. She created an underground network to protect the victims. The sound of footsteps made them look up. David Lancaster stood in the doorway, his face pale. I see you found out about my sister, he said. Your sister? Sarah stood, her mind racing. Why didn't you tell us? David walked slowly down the aisle, his shoulders heavy with old grief. Catherine was the first to discover what our father was doing. She tried to stop him, but he was too powerful. When she realized she couldn't fight him directly, she found another way. He pulled an old leather journal from his briefcase. This was hers. She documented everything. The experiments, the victims, the escape routes. She worked with a young security officer at Blackwood Industries. He looked meaningfully at Sarah. Your mother. Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Mum, she knew Catherine? They worked together for years, building a network of safe houses and sympathetic doctors. When Catherine disappeared, Julia continued their work. That's how she met your father. He was helping them secretly, using his position in the company to protect as many people as he could. Jenny, who had been examining the other documents, suddenly gasped. Sarah, look at this. The dates, the locations. Some of these safe houses are still operating. They've been hiding and helping victims all this time. Father Michael nodded slowly. I've suspected something like this. Sometimes people would show up at the church knowing exactly what to say to get help. They had a system, a way of identifying themselves. Sarah's mind was whirling with possibilities. We need to find these places. Let them know they're not alone anymore, that it's safe to come out of hiding. There's more, David said, opening the journal to a marked page. Catherine didn't just help people escape. She collected evidence, decades of it. She created a failsafe, a way to expose everything if something happened to her. Where is it? Sarah asked. Hidden in plain sight, in the one place no one would think to look. David pointed to a photograph of the old Lancaster mansion. In my father's own house. Catherine converted part of the basement into a secure vault before she disappeared. Everything she gathered is still there, waiting to be found. Jenny was already on her phone, coordinating with Mr. Chen's security team. The mansion's been abandoned for years. We can have a team there within the hour. Sarah looked at the photograph of Catherine Lancaster, seeing the same determination in her eyes that she'd seen in her mother's. "All this time," she said softly, "there were others fighting the same battle. We weren't alone." Father Michael placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "This is why your work is so important, Sarah. You're not just helping the victims, you're bringing all these hidden truths to light. You're finishing what they started." "We'll need to move carefully," David warned. "Even after all these years, there are people who don't want these secrets revealed. My father may be gone, but his old allies are still out there." Sarah straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of her mother's locket against her chest. "Then we'll be careful. But we won't stop. Catherine, Mom, Dad, they risked everything to protect people. We owe it to them to finish what they started." The setting sun cast long shadows through the church windows, but Sarah felt more clarity than ever. Another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, revealing an even larger picture of courage and resistance than she had imagined. "Jenny, contact Dr. Martinez and the others. We need to plan this carefully." She turned to Father Michael. "Can we use the church as a coordination point? It's where this all started, after all." The priest nodded, a small smile on his face. "The church has always been a sanctuary for those seeking truth and justice. That won't change now." As they began to plan, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The network of heroes and helpers had been larger than anyone knew, working in shadows for decades to protect the vulnerable. Now it was time to bring everything into the light. The Lancaster mansion loomed against the darkening sky, its Victorian architecture casting strange shadows in the twilight. Sarah stood at the iron gates, surrounded by Mr. Chen's security team and a group of FBI agents. The old house had been empty for years, but tonight it would finally give up its secrets. "The basement access is through the kitchen," David Lancaster explained, leading them up the overgrown driveway. "Catherine showed me once, though I was too young to understand its significance then. Dr. Martinez had insisted on coming, bringing medical supplies in case they found any evidence that needed special handling. Some of these records could be fragile," she said. "We need to preserve everything carefully." The front door creaked open, revealing dusty furniture draped in white sheets. Their flashlights created dancing shadows on the walls as they made their way through the grand entrance hall. Family portraits watched their progress, including one of a young Catherine Lancaster, her eyes seeming to follow them. "Here," David said, stopping at a kitchen panel that looked no different from the others. He pressed a hidden mechanism and the panel swung open to reveal a narrow staircase. "Catherine designed this herself. The vault is at the bottom." Sarah led the way down, her heart pounding with each step. The basement was larger than she expected, with multiple rooms branching off a central corridor. At the end was a heavy steel door with an old-fashioned combination lock. "The numbers are in her journal," David said, pulling out the worn book. As he turned to the marked page, something fell from between the leaves, a photograph Sarah had never seen before. It showed 4 people standing together: Catherine Lancaster, Julia Morgan, James Blackwood, and a 4th person Sarah didn't recognize. They were all smiling, looking hopeful despite the burden they carried. "That's Eleanor Chen," a quiet voice said. Mrs. Chen had arrived following them down. "My mother-in-law. She was part of their network too, helping to hide people in the Chinese community." Mr. Chen stared at the photo in shock. "Mother never told me. She always said her charity work was just helping immigrants settle in." "She was protecting you," Mrs. Chen said gently. "The less anyone knew, the safer everyone was. That's why Mr. Chen and I recognized what was happening when Sarah brought Thomas to us. Mother had taught us the signs without ever explaining why." David had found the combination and was working on the lock. With a final click, the heavy door swung open, revealing a room that took everyone's breath away. The vault was a testament to Catherine's determination. Floor-to-ceiling filing cabinets lined the walls, each carefully labeled and organized. Tables held boxes of photographs, recordings, and medical files. But most striking was the wall of faces, hundreds of photographs of victims and survivors, each with a name and date carefully noted beneath. "She documented everything," David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Every person they helped, every crime they uncovered." Dr. Martinez was already examining the medical files. "These records are incredible. Detailed documentation of the experiments, the effects, the treatments they tried. This could help us, help even more people." FBI agents began carefully cataloging everything, while Sarah walked slowly around the room, taking it all in. On one desk, she found a letter addressed simply, "To those who follow." With trembling hands, she opened it and began to read Catherine's words. "If you're reading this, you've chosen to continue the fight. Know that you're not alone. We've worked in shadows for years, building a network of helpers and healers, gathering evidence, and protecting those we could. Some of us didn't survive this fight, but we never lost hope that someday someone would finish what we started. To whoever finds this, the truth is now in your hands. Use it wisely. Use it to heal, to help, to prevent these crimes from ever happening again. The victims deserve justice, but more than that, they deserve to know they weren't forgotten. Remember, the greatest weapon against evil is not violence or vengeance, but light. Bring everything into the light. Let the truth be known. Let healing begin." With hope and faith in the future, Catherine Lancaster. Sarah looked up from the letter to find everyone watching her. In that moment, she felt the weight of responsibility, but also the strength of the legacy she had inherited. "We'll need to expand the recovery center," she said firmly. "Create a proper archive. Make all of this accessible to investigators and historians. The truth belongs to everyone now." David nodded, picking up a file. Catherine would have wanted that. No more secrets, no more shadows. As they began the careful process of documenting and removing the vault's contents, Sarah thought about all the brave people who had come before her: Catherine, her parents, Eleanor Chen, and countless others whose names she might never know. They had fought in darkness so that someday others could walk in light. The work would take weeks, maybe months, but every file, every photograph, every piece of evidence would help bring justice and healing to more families. The network Catherine had built would become part of something bigger, something that would help ensure such crimes could never happen again. The new wing of the recovery center hummed with activity as volunteers and staff worked to process the contents of Catherine's vault. What had once been a recreation room had been transformed into a research center, with sophisticated scanning equipment and preservation tools lining the walls. Sarah moved between the workstations, watching as each piece of evidence revealed new connections. Dr. Martinez had set up a digital mapping system that displayed relationships between victims, helpers, and those responsible for the experiments. The wall-sized screen looked like an intricate web, growing more complex with each new entry. "We've identified 3 more safe houses still in operation," Jenny reported, pointing to locations on a map. "One in Montreal, 1 in Amsterdam, and 1 in Sydney. They've been helping people escape similar programs in other countries." Catherine's network was more extensive than we imagined, Thomas said, examining a folder of international correspondence. She didn't just help local victims, she created a global underground railroad for people fleeing corporate exploitation. Angela, who had taken charge of interviewing survivors, approached with a tablet. "You need to see this," she said, pulling up a video interview. "We found one of Catherine's original helpers. She's been running a shelter in Vancouver for 30 years. The video showed an elderly woman named Grace Chen, no relation to Mr. and Mrs. Chen, speaking quietly about her work with Catherine and Julia. "We never knew everyone involved," she explained. "It was safer that way, but we had signals, ways of identifying each other. A silver locket worn on a blue ribbon, a particular phrase used in conversation." Sarah touched her mother's locket, unconsciously. That's why Mom always wore it this way, she realized. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a signal to others in the network. David Lancaster arrived with another box of documents from the mansion. Found these hidden behind a false wall, he said. They're different from the others. Personal correspondence between Catherine and her contacts. As they began sorting through the letters, a pattern emerged. Catherine hadn't just been documenting crimes, she had been building evidence against powerful people who profited from human suffering. The names included corporate executives, politicians, and influential figures from around the world. This is why they tried so hard to stop her, Thomas said grimly. She wasn't just threatening one company, she was threatening an entire system of corruption. Father Michael, who had been helping organize the archive, held up a photograph. "Look at this," he said. It showed a group of children playing in what appeared to be a secret shelter. The date on this, it was taken here in the church basement. I had no idea it went back that far. Mrs. Chen studied the photograph. "I recognize some of these faces," she said. "They're community leaders now, people who've been helping us with the recovery center. They never forgot the help they received." The sound of excited voices drew their attention to one of the research stations. Emily, home from college to help with the project, was waving them over. "We cracked another code in Catherine's journals," she announced. She didn't just document what was happening. She was developing a methodology for exposing and dismantling these operations. "Look at this." The journal pages contained detailed analyses of corporate structures, methods for identifying front, companies and strategies for helping victims escape and recover. Catherine had created a comprehensive playbook for fighting corporate abuse. "This is incredible," Dr. Martinez said, scanning through the pages. She wasn't just reacting to problems, she was creating solutions. Many of her ideas align perfectly with what we've been developing at the Recovery Center. Sarah felt a deep connection to this woman she had never met. Catherine Lancaster had faced the same challenges, fought the same battles, dreamed of the same changes they were now implementing. "We need to share this knowledge," she decided, "not just the evidence of crimes, but the solutions Catherine developed, her methods for helping people, her strategies for exposing corruption. It could help activists and reformers around the world." "But carefully," Thomas cautioned. "There are still people who would rather these secrets stay buried." Jenny was already coordinating with their international contacts. The United Nations team is especially interested in Catherine's documentation methods. They want to create global standards for investigating corporate human rights abuses. As the day progressed, more revelations emerged from Catherine's archives. They found evidence of other networks similar to hers, working independently, but toward the same goals. The web of helpers and healers was vast, spanning continents and decades. "It's like finding missing pieces of a puzzle," Angela observed, watching the relationship map grow more complex. All these people working in isolation, thinking they were alone, but they were all part of something bigger. Sarah stood before the wall of photographs from Catherine's vault, now expanded with images they had collected from other sources. Faces of victims and survivors, helpers and healers, all connected by threads of courage and compassion. "We're not just continuing their work," she said softly. "We're bringing it all together, making it stronger. Everything they fought for in shadows, we can now do in the light." The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows, but the research center remained busy. Each document processed, each connection discovered, brought them closer to understanding the full scope of both the crimes and the resistance against them. It was a legacy of darkness and light, horror and hope, now finally being revealed in its entirety. The international conference room at Blackwood Industries was filled to capacity. Representatives from corporations, humanitarian organizations, and government agencies around the world had gathered to learn about what was now being called the Lancaster-Blackwood Protocol, a comprehensive approach to corporate reform and victim rehabilitation. Sarah stood at the podium, looking out at the assembled crowd. Just 18 months ago, she had been a homeless girl helping a stranger in the rain. Now she was helping to reshape how the world thought about corporate responsibility and human rights. "The protocol isn't just about addressing past wrongs," she explained, gesturing to the presentation behind her. "It's about preventing future abuses. Every aspect of our program, from investigation methods to rehabilitation techniques, is designed to be adaptable and implementable anywhere." Dr. Martinez took the stage next, presenting the medical findings they had compiled from Catherine's records and their own research. By combining historical data with modern treatment approaches, we've developed more effective ways to help victims recover, both physically and psychologically. The audience was particularly interested in the rehabilitation center's success rates. Over the past year, they had helped hundreds of survivors recover and rebuild their lives. Many, like Angela and Emily, had gone on to become helpers themselves. During the break, Sarah found herself speaking with the CEO of a major pharmaceutical company. "We've discovered similar issues in our corporate history," he admitted, "but we've been afraid to address them, worried about the legal and financial implications." "That fear is part of the problem," Sarah replied. "We found that transparency and active remediation actually strengthen companies in the long run. Our market value has increased since we began this work." Thomas joined them, supporting himself on his cane. "The key is commitment," he added. "Half measures don't work. You have to be willing to expose everything and make real changes." The afternoon sessions focused on the global network they had discovered through Catherine's records. Mr. Chen presented their findings on how the Underground Railroad for corporate victims had operated and how its methods could be adapted for modern use. "The safe houses Catherine established didn't just hide people," he explained. "They helped them heal, rebuild their lives, and often become helpers themselves. It's a model we've incorporated into our own program." Mrs. Chen and Father Michael led a workshop on community integration, showing how local organizations could support corporate reform efforts. Their work with the Recovery Center had become a model for similar programs around the world. "The most important thing we've learned," Father Michael told the attendees, "is that healing happens in community. No one recovers alone." During the final panel discussion, David Lancaster shared personal insights about growing up in a family that profited from human suffering and how confronting that legacy had led to healing and redemption. "My sister Catherine understood something crucial," he said. "The answer to corporate abuse isn't just punishment, it's transformation, complete, systematic change that addresses both the causes and the consequences of exploitation." As the conference drew to a close, Sarah found herself in the memorial garden with Jenny, looking at the newest addition, a sculpture commemorating Catherine Lancaster and all the unknown helpers who had fought corporate abuse over the decades. "It's amazing how many companies are adopting our protocols," Jenny remarked, reviewing the day's commitments. 23 corporations have already signed on to implement the full program. Sarah touched her mother's locket, thinking of all the brave people who had fought this battle before her. They're realizing that doing the right thing isn't just morally correct, it's good business. Ethical practices, transparent operations, genuine commitment to human welfare. These things create stronger companies. The sound of children's laughter drifted over from the recovery center's playground. Sarah smiled, remembering her own transformation from a scared, lonely child to someone who could help create real change in the world. "Ms. Blackwood," a young intern approached, hesitantly. "There's a group of corporate whistleblowers who would like to meet with you. They say they have evidence of ongoing abuse in their companies." Sarah exchanged glances with Jenny. More lives to help, more wrongs to right, more changes to implement. The work would never really be finished, but now they had a proven method for addressing these issues, a way to bring healing to both victims and organizations. "Tell them I'll be right there," she said. "And Jenny, let's make sure Dr. Martinez and the team are available. These people have taken a brave step. Let's show them they're not alone." As they walked back to the main building, Sarah thought about that rainy night that had started everything. One small act of kindness had created ripples that were now reaching around the world, touching countless lives and changing how businesses operated. The Lancaster-Blackwood Protocol wasn't just a set of guidelines. It was a testament to the power of truth, courage, and compassion. It proved that even the darkest histories could be transformed into sources of healing and hope. The Recovery Center's new global communications hub buzzed with activity. Screens displayed video feeds from similar facilities around the world, each one established using the Lancaster-Blackwood Protocol. Sarah watched as Angela coordinated with teams in Tokyo, Sao Paulo, and London, sharing treatment updates and success stories. The Bangkok facility just reported another successful reunion, Angela announced, marking it on their digital tracking system. A family separated by corporate trafficking 15 years ago, they found each other through our global database. The database had been one of their most significant achievements, a secure system that helped victims and their families find each other across borders and decades. It combined Catherine's meticulous records with modern technology, creating a powerful tool for healing and reconnection. "Dr. Martinez wants you in the research wing," Jenny said, approaching with her ever-present tablet. "They've made a breakthrough with the treatment protocols." In the state-of-the-art laboratory, Dr. Martinez was reviewing results with an international team of medical experts. The wall screens displayed complex molecular structures and treatment data. "We've finally cracked it," she said excitedly as Sarah entered. "The genetic markers that show long-term exposure to the experimental drugs. We can identify them now. This means we can track down victims who don't even know they were exposed. And help them before they develop symptoms," Thomas added, joining them. He moved more confidently now, though he still kept his cane nearby. "We can prevent suffering instead of just treating it." The implications were enormous. They could now proactively reach out to people at risk, offering treatment before the damage became severe. It was exactly the kind of breakthrough Catherine and Julia had dreamed of achieving. A commotion in the main hall drew their attention. Mrs. Chen was welcoming a group of corporate executives, not from companies under investigation, but from businesses wanting to implement ethical reforms before problems developed. "Prevention is becoming our main focus," Mr. Chen explained, leading the executives on a tour. "Companies are realizing it's better to address potential issues now than face crises later." Sarah joined the tour, listening as Mr. Chen explained their corporate ethics training program. The executives asked thoughtful questions, showing genuine interest in creating positive change. "We've seen the statistics," one CEO said. "Companies that implement the protocol show better long-term stability and growth. It's not just about doing good, it's about building sustainable businesses." In the training center, Emily was leading a session for corporate compliance officers. She had developed a program that combined her personal experience as a survivor with her business education, creating a powerful teaching tool. "Ethics isn't just about rules and regulations," she told her audience. "It's about understanding the real human impact of corporate decisions. Every policy, every procedure affects actual lives." The afternoon brought a special ceremony in the memorial garden. They were dedicating a new section honoring the modern helpers, people who had taken Catherine's legacy and built upon it. The wall displayed photographs of Dr. Martinez, the Chens, Father Michael, and many others who had joined their cause. "It's important to remember that this work continues," Father Michael said during the dedication. "Every person who chooses to help, to speak up, to make changes, they're part of this legacy now." As the ceremony concluded, Sarah received an urgent message. A major technology company had discovered unethical testing in their supply chain and wanted help implementing the protocol. "They're not trying to cover it up," Jenny reported, reviewing the details. "They want to do a full investigation, help any victims, and completely reform their procedures." "That's a change from the old days," Thomas observed, when companies fought to hide their problems instead of fixing them. Sarah gathered her team to plan their response. The situation would require careful handling, supporting the company's reform efforts while ensuring justice for any victims. But they had done this before, and their methods were proven. "We'll need to coordinate with our Asian facilities," Dr. Martinez said, pulling up regional medical data. "Most of the supply chain issues are in that region." Mr. Chen was already contacting his security teams. "We should also connect with local advocacy groups. They often know about problems before they're officially reported." As they worked, Sarah noticed a young intern watching them intently. She recognized the look. It was the same one she'd had when she first discovered she could make a difference. "Would you like to help?" she asked the intern. The young woman nodded eagerly. "I want to learn everything. My mother, she was helped by one of Catherine's safe houses years ago. I grew up hearing stories about the underground network. I never thought I'd get to be part of something like this." Sarah smiled, remembering her own journey from help to helper. "That's how it works," she said. "The people we help often become the next generation of helpers. It's how the network grows stronger." Through the windows, she could see the recovery center's grounds filled with activity, survivors becoming advocates, victims becoming healers, broken things being restored. The ripples of change continued to spread, touching more lives every day. An alert sounded from the Global Communications Hub. Another facility was reporting in, another family reunited, another company choosing reform over corruption. The work continued, growing and evolving, but always guided by the principles Catherine and Julia had established so long ago. The rain fell softly outside Sarah's office window at Blackwood Industries, reminding her of another rainy night, too. Years ago, she stood watching the droplets trace patterns on the glass, holding her mother's locket in one hand and Catherine's journal in the other. "Thinking deep thoughts?" Thomas asked, entering the office with a stack of reports. The latest data from their global facilities showed remarkable progress. Thousands of lives touched, hundreds of families reunited, dozens of companies transformed. "I was remembering," Sarah replied. "That night in the rain, when I found you, how close I came to walking away." "But you didn't," Thomas said softly. "You chose to help. Just like your mother did, like Catherine did, like so many others before us." Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent call from the recovery center. Dr. Martinez's face appeared on the video screen, her expression excited. "You need to come to the center right away," she said. "There's someone here you should meet." When they arrived, they found the main hall filled with people. At the center of the crowd was an elderly woman Sarah had never seen before, yet something about her seemed familiar. "Sarah," Dr. Martinez said, "this is Margaret Lancaster, Catherine's daughter." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. The woman before her had Catherine's eyes, the same determined look she'd seen in the old photographs. "I've been following your work," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "When I saw what you'd done with my mother's research, how you'd brought everything into the light, I knew it was time to come forward." She opened a briefcase and pulled out more journals, photographs, and documents. "Mother didn't tell me everything, but she made sure I knew where to find her final records. I've been protecting them all these years, waiting for the right time." The materials provided the missing pieces they had been seeking, final connections, hidden links, answers to long-standing questions. But more than that, they contained Catherine's vision for the future. She believed this day would come, Margaret explained, when the work could be done openly, when companies would choose ethics over profit, when victims could find justice and healing. As they examined the new materials, more people arrived at the center. Survivors who had been helped by Catherine's network, children and grandchildren of those she had saved, helpers who had carried on her work in secret. "It's amazing," Jenny said, watching the reunions and revelations unfold. All these people, all these stories, connected across generations. Angela, who had become the center's head of survivor services, was already organizing interviews, ensuring that every story would be preserved and honored. "Each person here represents a choice," she observed. "Someone who chose to help instead of turning away, to speak up instead of staying silent." In the memorial garden, Sarah stood with Thomas and Margaret, looking at the wall of helpers past and present. Catherine's photograph held a central place alongside Julia Morgan and James Blackwood. "They would be proud," Margaret said, touching her mother's picture, "not just of what you've accomplished, but of how you've done it. Bringing healing instead of vengeance, transformation instead of punishment." The sound of children's laughter drew their attention to the playground, where a new generation played freely, safely, their lives untouched by the shadows that had haunted their parents. "That's the real victory," Thomas said. "Not just helping victims, but preventing new ones, breaking the cycle of exploitation and silence." Sarah touched her mother's locket, thinking of all the brave people who had worn similar signals over the years. Each one had faced a choice, to help or turn away, to speak or remain silent. "We're all connected," she said softly. "Everyone. Whoever chose to help, to heal, to make things right. It's not just about the past anymore. It's about building a better future." As evening fell, the recovery center glowed with warmth and purpose. In offices around the world, similar facilities were operating, each one a beacon of hope and healing. The Lancaster Blackwood Protocol had become more than a set of guidelines. It was a movement, a commitment to corporate responsibility and human dignity. Sarah walked through the halls, watching as stories were shared, wounds were healed, and connections were made. From a scared girl helping a stranger in the rain, she had become part of something larger than herself. A network of light pushing back against darkness, of hope overcoming fear, of small choices leading to profound change. The rain had stopped, and through the windows she could see stars beginning to appear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new opportunities to help. But they were ready, stronger together than they had ever been alone, carrying forward a legacy of courage and compassion that would continue to touch lives for generations to come. The grand auditorium of Blackwood Industries was filled to capacity. 2.5 years after that fateful rainy night, hundreds of people had gathered for a special event, the inauguration of the Global Corporate Ethics Institute, a new organization dedicated to preventing corporate abuse and supporting recovery worldwide. Sarah stood backstage, smoothing her jacket nervously. Through the curtain, she could see familiar faces in the audience, survivors who had become advocates, corporate leaders who had embraced reform, helpers who had worked in shadows, now stepping into the light. "Ready?" Thomas asked, standing beside her. He had insisted on walking without his cane today, a symbol of how far they had all come in their recovery. "I was thinking about what to say," Sarah replied. "How to explain everything that's brought us to this moment." "Just speak from your heart," Margaret Lancaster said, joining them. Since coming forward with Catherine's final records, she had become an integral part of their team, bringing decades of hidden wisdom into the open. The ceremony began with a video presentation showing the global impact of the Lancaster Blackwood Protocol. Images flashed across massive screens, recovery centers on 5 continents, corporate reform programs, reunited families, transformed lives. Dr. Martinez presented the latest medical breakthroughs, treatments now available worldwide, prevention, programs reaching vulnerable communities, research being shared openly instead of hidden away. Angela and Emily, now heading their own departments, shared success stories from the Survivor Support Network. Their presentation showed how former victims had become leaders, teachers, and healers, creating a cycle of positive change. Mr. and Mrs. Chen unveiled new security protocols designed to protect whistleblowers and vulnerable populations, while Father Michael spoke about the role of community support in corporate reform. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she walked to the podium carrying her mother's locket and Catherine's journal. The audience fell silent, many of them knowing the significance of these items. 2.5 years ago, she began, I was a homeless girl who made a choice in the rain. I chose to help someone in need, not knowing that decision would change not just my life but countless others. She opened the locket, removing a small key that had been hidden inside all these years. This key opened more than just a safety deposit box. It unlocked a legacy of courage, compassion, and change that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge. Sarah held up Catherine's journal. In here, Catherine Lancaster wrote about her dream of a future where corporations would choose ethics over exploitation, where profit would not come at the cost of human dignity. Today, we're making that dream a reality. She gestured to the audience. Look around you. Every person here represents a choice, to help instead of harm, to speak instead of stay silent, to transform instead of destroy. We're all connected by these choices, part of a legacy that stretches back generations and forward into the future. The screens behind her showed images of Catherine, Julia, James, and all the others who had fought for change. They worked in darkness so we could work in light. They kept hope alive so we could make it flourish. Their courage laid the foundation for everything we've built. Sarah introduced new initiatives, educational programs for business schools, support systems for companies transitioning to ethical practices, expanded rehabilitation services for survivors and their families. The Global Corporate Ethics Institute isn't just another organization, she explained. It's a commitment to ensuring that what happened in the past cannot happen again. It's a promise to every person who has ever suffered from corporate abuse. You are not alone, you are not forgotten, and your story matters. As she spoke, she noticed movement at the back of the auditorium. More people were arriving, survivors from around the world, corporate reformers, advocates and helpers. They stood along the walls, filled the aisles, each one representing a life touched by their work. We've learned something vital these past years, Sarah continued. Change doesn't come from one person or one organization. It comes from all of us choosing day after day to do what's right, to help others, to stand up for what we believe in. She touched the locket around her neck. My mother wore this as a signal to others in the underground network. Today, we don't need secret signals anymore. We can work openly, share freely, help boldly. The network that once operated in shadows now shines in the light. The audience rose in a standing ovation, but Sarah wasn't finished. She had one more announcement to make, one that would ensure their work would continue for generations to come. Today, we're establishing the Lancaster Morgan Foundation, she revealed, a permanent endowment to support corporate reform, victim recovery, and ethical business education worldwide. The foundation will ensure that the principles we've developed, the lessons we've learned, and the progress we've made will continue to grow and evolve. As applause filled the auditorium, Sarah looked out at the faces before her, survivors and helpers, reformers and advocates, all part of something larger than themselves. The frightened girl who had once hidden from the world was gone, replaced by someone who had found her purpose in helping others find their way out of darkness. The evening reception following the inauguration was held in the Recovery Center's garden, now a sprawling oasis of healing and hope. Lights twinkled in the oak trees, and the air was filled with the sound of conversation and laughter, sounds that would have seemed impossible in this place just a few years ago. Sarah moved through the crowd, watching as people who had once been strangers now embraced like family. Survivors shared stories with corporate leaders, their experiences helping to shape new policies and practices. Former victims celebrated with those who had helped them heal, the boundaries between helper and helped blurring as all became part of the same community. "Look at this," Angela said, showing Sarah her tablet. "We just got word from the Singapore facility. They've successfully implemented the new treatment protocol, 20 more survivors fully recovered." Before Sarah could respond, Emily rushed up with more news. The education program is being adopted by business schools worldwide. Next semester, the Lancaster Blackwood Protocol will be part of the standard curriculum at over 200 universities. Dr. Martinez joined them, her eyes bright with excitement. And the medical research is being shared globally. No more patents, no more restricted access. Everything we learn helps everyone. Thomas watched it all with quiet pride, standing with Margaret Lancaster near the memorial wall. The photographs of their loved ones seemed to watch over the gathering, their dreams of justice and healing finally realized. "Catherine would have loved this," Margaret said, touching her mother's picture. "All these people working together, openly, creating real change." Mr. and Mrs. Chen approached with a group of international security experts. "The new protection protocols are being implemented worldwide," Mr. Chen reported. "Companies are finally prioritizing whistleblower safety and victim support. And communities are coming together to help," Mrs. Chen added. "The network is stronger than ever because it's no longer hidden." Father Michael, who had been speaking with a group of corporate ethics officers, joined their conversation. "The most remarkable thing," he observed, "is how the healing spreads. Each person who recovers helps others recover. Each company that reforms inspires other companies to change." Sarah noticed a young girl watching them from near the fountain. She recognized the look in the child's eyes, the same mixture of fear and hope. she had once felt herself. "Hi there," she said, approaching slowly. "I'm Sarah." "I know," the girl replied. "My mom told me about you. She said you help people who got hurt by bad companies." "That's right. Did you and your mom need help?" The girl shook her head. "No. I want to learn how to help others. Like you did." Sarah felt her heart warm. This was the future they had been working toward, a world where the next generation would focus on helping rather than hiding, on preventing harm rather than just recovering from it. She led the girl to the memorial wall, showing her the photographs and telling her the stories of Catherine, Julia, and all the others who had paved the way for this moment. Everyone here made a choice, she explained. They chose to help others, to stand up for what's right, to make things better. And now you can make that choice too. As evening deepened into night, the garden remained full of people sharing stories, making plans, building connections. Sarah found herself back at her favorite bench, watching it all unfold. Jenny brought her a final update for the day. The Lancaster Morgan Foundation is already receiving support from around the world. Companies, individuals, organizations. Everyone wants to be part of this. Thomas sat beside her, finally allowing himself to use his cane again. "You know what I see when I look at all this?" he asked. "I see your mother's compassion, your father's integrity, Catherine's vision. But I also see you, the girl who chose to help a stranger in the rain." Sarah touched her locket, thinking of all the brave people who had worn similar signals over the years. "We're all connected," she said softly. "Everyone who ever chose to help, to heal, to make things right. The past, the present, the future. It's all one continuous circle of hope." The stars emerged above the garden, their light mingling with the lanterns in the trees. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new opportunities to help. But they were ready, all of them together, carrying forward a legacy of courage and compassion that would continue to grow and touch lives for generations to come. In the distance, thunder rumbled softly, and a gentle rain began to fall. But, unlike that night 2.5 years ago, no one ran for shelter. They stood together in the rain, letting it wash over them like a blessing, a reminder of how far they had come and how much farther they could go. 3 years to the day after. Finding Thomas in the rain, Sarah stood at the entrance of the newest Blackwood Recovery Center. This one was special, built in the heart of the city where her journey had begun, designed specifically to help children who had been affected by corporate exploitation. The building was bright and welcoming, its walls decorated with colorful murals painted by survivors. The playground equipment gleamed in the morning sun, and the garden was filled with flowers chosen by the children themselves. "Ready?" Thomas asked, standing beside her. He no longer needed his cane at all, though he kept it in his office as a reminder of how far they had come. "Almost," Sarah replied, touching the silver locket that still hung around her neck. "Just thinking about how everything has changed." "Doctor." Martinez approached with the final inspection reports. "Everything's perfect," she said. "The medical facilities, the counseling rooms, the education center, it's all ready." Through the gates, Sarah could see families beginning to arrive. Parents holding their children's hands, teenagers walking in groups, small ones being carried by caregivers. Each face told a story of survival, of hope, of the possibility of healing. Angela and Emily were greeting the arrivals, their own experiences helping them connect with the newcomers. They had developed special programs for young survivors, combining therapy with education and skill development. "Look who's here," Mrs. Chen called out, waving to a familiar figure approaching the entrance. It was the little girl from the Institute inauguration, now accompanied by 3 other children she had helped bring to the center. "I told them about you," the girl said proudly to Sarah, "about how you helped people when you were just a kid. Like us, they want to learn how to help too." Mr. Chen joined them, his security team doing final checks of the facility. "Everything's secure," he reported, "but open. That's the balance we wanted. Safe but not restrictive. Protected but not isolated." Father Michael arrived with a group from his youth outreach program. "The community support has been overwhelming," he said. "People want to be part of this. They understand now that helping others helps everyone. Margaret Lancaster, who had become a mentor to many of the young survivors, gathered everyone in the main hall. The walls here were special, covered with photographs and stories of healing, of transformation, of lives rebuilt. "Today," Sarah began, addressing the assembled crowd, "we're not just opening a new facility. We're continuing a legacy that began generations ago, with people who dared to stand up against injustice, who chose to help others even when it was dangerous to do so." She gestured to the photographs on the walls: Catherine Lancaster, Julia Morgan, James Blackwood, and now hundreds of others who had joined their cause. Their courage created a foundation that we continue to build upon. Every person who walks through these doors becomes part of that legacy. Jenny brought forward a special display: the original notebook Sarah had found in Thomas's wheelchair, Catherine's journal, and Julia's letters. "These records helped us expose the truth," Sarah explained. "But more importantly, they taught us how to help, how to heal, how to transform pain into purpose." The children gathered around, their eyes wide as they looked at these pieces of history. Sarah saw in their faces the same determination she had felt as a young girl, the desire to make things better, to help others, to be part of something meaningful. "Each of you has a story," she told them, "and each of you has the power to help write new stories. That's what this place is for, not just healing the past, but building a better future." As if on cue, the sun broke through the morning clouds, sending streams of light through the building's many windows. The effect was beautiful: shadows retreating, darkness giving way to light, just as fear was giving way to hope in so many lives. "Our journey isn't over," Sarah concluded, looking out at the faces before her. Survivors and helpers, young and old, all part of the same continuing story. "It's just beginning in new ways, with new people joining us every day." She touched her mother's locket one last time, feeling the strength of all those who had come before, their courage and compassion flowing into the present moment. "This is how change happens," she said softly. "One person helping another, then another, then another, until the circle of healing grows large enough to encompass everyone." Outside, the city was awakening to a new day. Inside the recovery center, new stories were beginning, new hopes were taking root, new possibilities were emerging. The cycle of healing continued, growing stronger with each life touched, each hand extended, each heart open to the possibility of transformation. And somewhere, in the great wheel of time, a scared little girl still stood in the rain, making the choice that would change everything, the choice to help, to care, to believe in the power of small acts of kindness to transform the world. The legacy lived on, not in buildings or programs or protocols, but in the countless small moments of courage and compassion that connected one heart to another, creating an unbreakable chain of hope that stretched from the past into the boundless promise of the future.